Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Co-host today, Daniel McAdams, is with us. Thank you for being here, Daniel.
How are you, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine, and have an interesting subject today. It's not totally new, it's repetitious, but it's not good news really for consistency in United States foreign policy.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it's a report that in spite of our criticism of internationalism of everything, it's a report that came out last week by IAEA, and the Inspector General from the agency is reporting back on Iran, on whether or not they are in compliance. Our president disagrees, he's arguing about all this, but the report actually comes in and reminds us of the time when the reports from the IAEA came in on Iraq. It always said Saddam Hussein is not doing this. Don't go to war, it's not true. But here the report comes in and they're saying that Iran is in complete compliance with this, which, and this report was just less than a week ago, and yet Trump has taken the position before this report came out. And I don't think they've ever been blatant and say they're not in compliance, they're not in compliance. And I think that was Tillerson's position too. But in a way they're saying this because they're saying, well, what about this and what about that? And they want to extend the requirements on the agreement. And right now we're sort of sidelined from this. You know, the P5+1 plus the United Nations are sticking by the argument that, Iran is not violating their agreement. So this is interesting, and yet it's a subject that not too many people in the United States will agree with us on. They're probably going to argue, well, you can't trust them, they're bad people, and they want to go on and on. But to me, it's the people who are saying this are the war propagandists. They like war or threat of war, potential war, because it's good for business. Yeah. I think that's what's been going on. But it's interesting that the president stands alone on this, and where he left it a few weeks ago was sort of in limbo. He says, I am not going to comply. I am not going to sign off that they are in compliance. I won't say they're not in compliance. Yeah. So it's sort of in limbo, and then he sort of threw it back to Congress, which theoretically is okay. But in the practical matter, the U.S. Congress didn't have a whole lot to do with this. It wasn't actually a treaty.
Well, the U.S. doesn't have a leg to stand on. Trump doesn't have a leg to stand on because they're either in compliance. The treaty, the deal is pretty specific and pretty concise. They are either in compliance with that or they're not. And so Trump, I think, understands that there's nothing he can point to say, okay, they're not doing this that they said they would do. So he has to say that, well, they're not complying with the spirit of the agreement. And nobody knows what that means. What is a spirit? It's a vague.
He's not complying with the things we think he should do anyway.
Yeah.
And it reminds us, of course, of how Scott Ritter talked to us, not only back leading up to the Iraq War, because he had this position of the chairman of this investigation and always said that Saddam Hussein was living up to his promises. But even recently, Scott's been on this program. He was at our conference. He says they're doing the same thing again. And in a way, what Trump is saying, well, they're not looking at every military assembly, operation. Everything is military. They have to have it. It had nothing to do with the agreement, and there's no reason anybody is assuming or could say, "Oh yeah, these military sites that they have, they might be working on a bomb." But it reminds me of the saying, which is a very legitimate in most cases, and that is, how do you prove a negative?
Yeah.
How can you prove that not a single square foot of land in Iran could be used, for building something nuclear? It means that it might be impossible to say, yeah, we inspected every inch, but the way they set up these agreements, they're reasonable, and if outsiders can come in and look at it, and they're honest inspectors, we should be able to get some information. It didn't help leading up to Iraq War. And right now, who knows what's happening? I think we've lost a little bit of credibility on this. I don't think that the whole world is jumping on. The P5 is P4 plus 1,
yeah.
and they're still, and Europe is trading with Iran. So I don't think they're going to join us. And as tough of a person that Trump is and taking a strong stance, I'm not so sure that we're operating in this area as a government of substantial force and reputation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, and I think Scott Ritter absolutely nailed it. First of all, he's been there and done that. He was the chief weapons inspector for the UN when it came to Iraq, so he saw the buildup. He saw the neocon lies leading up to the war, and he warned us both on this show when we had him on, and also he spoke at our conference, as you remember, in Washington, the Ron Paul Institute conference in September, and he said this is exactly what they're going to do. They're going to keep, the U.S. is going to keep ramping up demands, imaginary artificial demands, and they'll keep doing it until the point where Iran says, no, hold on, we're not going to allow that to happen. Then the U.S. will scream, refusal, not in compliance. That's exactly what Nikki Haley did toward the end of September, just a couple of weeks after Scott warned us. She said that, they're not allowing us into all of their sites. They're not complying because they're not letting us go everywhere. When that was never part of the deal, it wasn't in the agreement. But they're trying to basically replay the Iraq War. They're doing it over. They're so shameless. They're replaying the Iraq War and hoping no one notices.
Well, it then raises the questions, what's behind this? Sometimes people say follow the money. Is there money involved in this? There may well be some money involved in this. Oil's involved. Militarism is involved. Military-industrial complex. All these things are involved. But then there's strategic allies that are involved. And probably the closest ally we have that's cheering us on would probably be Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
I mean, that's their arch enemy. Has been going on for a long time, and I don't think Israel's going to object to Trump's position on this as well. So that's the background noise that may be the motivating factor, even though it makes no sense. Now, this of course raises the question: what should the American people know about, and what should they believe? Because if it's in a hush-hush manner and they don't know, they're liable to capitulate and not pay much attention, and then not only will we be allies of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, maybe we'll be allies with Saudi Arabia in another geographic area.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing that the Saudis and Israelis would like more than to have us do their fighting for them, to have the U.S. go in and start a war with Iran without understanding it would be a catastrophic war for Saudi Arabia and possibly for Israel. Iran takes out the oil fields. That's the only game that the Saudis have going in town. But you made a point earlier that I think is really interesting and worth exploring, which is that Trump's position on the Iran deal, because the allies in Europe are not following it as they were expected to, that President Trump is actually isolating the U.S. From the rest of the world. He is the isolationist. I thought we were supposed to be the isolationists, but he's isolating. He's making the U.S. less relevant in the bigger scheme of things.
That would be fine if we had no obligations and we had no intention on, beefing up the forces and being available and putting on sanctions and enforcing them. I think that kind of intervention is alive as well. But the isolation part, I think, is a good point. But, sorting all this out and letting the people know what is true and whether the Iranians are really, in violation, that's one issue. But there's another issue that's going on right now that I think is built on deception to the American people, and that is, how many troops do we have in which countries? They have reports that you can look into it, and I was pretty shocked to find out that you can figure out certain countries, where they are, and yet there's 29,000 that we don't even know where they are. They're not in this country, they're out, but they're not reported to the public. They don't know exactly where they are. And the reason this came up, Anti-War had some good reports on this, and they point out that what is reported is that we have like 500 troops in Syria, which we're not supposed, what is legally supposed to be there, like zero?
Zero.
But we own Iraq, so to speak, so there's more than 5,000 there. But But recent reports, when it's dissected out, instead of 500, there's actually 1,700 in Syria and almost 9,000 in Iraq. But that's not reported. But the assumption is that Trump has no problem with this. As a matter of fact, he doesn't think it should be reported. The enemy doesn't know how much troops we have and where they are, and we should keep this secret, keep them off balance. But the problem is, if the enemy is the group that's not supposed to have this, why are we, the American people, incorporated into the enemy? And even it's difficult for some of members of Congress. Remember, the members of Congress didn't know we had troops in Nigeria, and turns out 52 countries in Africa. We own Africa too, in essence. So this idea that we're keeping our enemies off balance, when did they become our enemies? Did they attack us? Have they bombed us? Have they invaded us? Have they put sanctions on us? No, they haven't done any of these things, but they're the enemies, and they better not know where our troops are. Who knows? We might have CIA agents in Iran for all we know.
And the idea that we're not allowed to have any idea where the U.S. military is fighting in our name is preposterous if we're supposed to be living in a free country. But you probably saw this. There was a great press conference, really funny. The spokesman for the U.S. troops in Syria, he was asked a question at a press conference, how many troops do we have in Syria? He said, well, we have about 2,500. They said, oh, that's interesting because you're only claiming 500. He said, did I say 2,500? I misspoke. I meant 500.
Now, he's higher than what this figure is that they just dug up.
So
but they could be part of that 29,000 we don't even know. And that comes out to be 10% of all our troops. Yeah. They have no idea where they are. Well, somebody has an idea where. So. And then that probably doesn't involve, those are military troops. That doesn't probably. Special forces might not be included, but the CIA won't be included. And then you have State Department officials at embassies around the world that are very much involved, almost like a troops on the ground type of thing. So there's so much information that we don't have, and it's all endorsed by people who believe in intervention, and they believe it in a moral, constitutional sense. I believe they're serious. They're completely wrong, but they claim we have this obligation to be there because we are the peacemakers of the world, and we don't want anything bad to happen. But when you look at this, there's a bit of deception going on, and they ought to be exposed.
And I think we have a right to wonder, what are the U.S. troops doing in Syria? We were told in 2014 by President Obama, we are going in to take out ISIS. President Trump used even more colorful language, saying we're going to wipe ISIS away. Well, ISIS is gone. They've been defeated in Syria. The last village was taken from ISIS. They're gone. So why do we maintain troops there? What's the real target? What's the real goal?
In economics, there's two poles on this. One is total authoritarianism, communism, and socialism. And then the other side is laissez-faire free markets. And in between, this management style is supposed to be, it can be called utilitarianism and pragmatism. And that in itself is a philosophy in economics. Well, in foreign policy, that's similar. They might be part of the realists and all that. We realize that the extremes of isolationism is bad and extremes of authoritarianism is bad. But if they're utilitarians and they look at it this way and they're realistic, why can't they use the successes and the failures to guide their policy? Do they have many successes since 9/11 to show that we have done something good for our country?
Yeah, in what way is the Middle East better now than when we first started, say even in 1990 or 91? How is it better? Like point to one point that's better than it was before.
And could it be actually a negative? Could people like Iran and their so-called enemies, seems like they're winning the wars, and everybody's turned against Russia. Russia, they're bad people again. So, but guess what? They're sorting things out, and right now, there's been a report that Putin may be involved in bringing the Syrians and Israelis together. That wouldn't be too bad of a deal like that. But in many ways, the evidence is just laying out there. The Iraq War is so dramatically negative, and what good has come of the Afghanistan war? But that never seems to say, well, maybe our theories are wrong. Maybe it's something wrong. And they'll say, you're right, Ron, that's true. We never fight to win.
Yeah.
We never have enough troops. They're still fighting Vietnam. Yeah, we had 500,000 there, but we never had enough troops. That's why we had to walk away and admit defeat, and then all those capitalists came in and they took over. We were supposed to stop the spread of communism, but after we left, of course, it became more capitalistic.
Yeah, they say we're leading from behind. We got to lead from forward. Well, I would just say, if I can wind it up, that I would say watch Nikki Haley, because Nikki Haley is the key point. I think also Wes Mitchell, who's doing the State Department's Europe stuff, he's going to be twisting some arms. Nikki Haley's going to be twisting some arms. I think it's a positive thing, as we pointed out, that the U.S. has become slightly irrelevant. We're not playing by the right rules, and so they're going to ignore us. That's a positive thing. That might send a good lesson.
No, I hope they get the lesson, and then that would lead to maybe thinking about a non-intervention or a lot less intervention type of foreign policy, and that would be very helpful. And it would also help the budget here and there, would also help the discrepancy in the wealth distribution. When you see the giant military corporations making hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, it would be a real challenge. And just think, if the policy changed, and those people argue, well, foreign expenditures and war expenditures is good for the economy, which is a bunch of baloney. It is not true. It's a distraction from the people having the money to spend it the way they want to, and that's also contributes to the wealth maldistribution. And that's the reason, most of the reason, or part of the reason why 50% of the people in this country have the equivalent wealth of 3 top billionaires, $100 billion. That is all a consequence of this. So if the money were not to be spent overseas in a wasteful manner, fighting wars that shouldn't exist, more money would be in the pockets of the people here at home, and maybe there would be less complaints about the problems of the super wealthy and the super poor. Because certainly our economy, though the government statistics right now are saying it's great and wonderful, is not a reflection of what a free market economy would be all about if you had balanced budgets and sound money. It doesn't resemble in any way. Everything is precarious, and even in spite of good statistics now, it's not built on sound economic policy, and there's not a sound foundation. So there's a lot of good reasons to think about foreign policy. Think about it also with civil liberties. Under the conditions of war, that's one of the first things they do. Even before we went to Iraq, we passed the Patriot Act. We had to attack the American people. Yes, we also started TSA, and virtually the undermining of liberties at home may be the most expensive loss that we have, is the loss of liberty at home, making it more difficult to fight the intellectual battles. And just look at how restrictions on freedom of expression, it has encroached even into the internet, where we have to be very, very cautious about being able to get our message out. So there's good reason to become non-intervention and support it and understand it, and make sure that we only support those individuals in Washington who actually believe and know and understand what non-intervention is all about. And it doesn't involve keeping the information away from the enemy, which includes the American people. No, I think we need a free and open society. We would become more prosperous, and we would become much safer. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.